Alright, so next we're going to go into local dodge and burn, which of course is the central section of this tutorial. I'm super excited. Our objectives here are to even out the disruptions and transitions in luminosity, and the tools we'll be using are curves and a contrast assist. So usually when I set up the layers and adjustments required for dodge and burn, I run an action, and I've attached this action for you. So if you would like to import it, go to your Actions tab, hit that little Options button, and go to Load Actions. In this case, I'm going to show you how to set up all the layers manually, just so you know exactly what goes into them. So first, we'll build the dodge and burn curves. For this, we'll use curves adjustments. For the dodge, we'll raise it about half a square, and for the burn, we'll lower it about half a square. So I'm going to go ahead and label these layers and invert the masks. I'm also going to toss these in a folder together and label that local dodge and burn. Next up, we're going to build the assist that's going to help us see the disruptions and transitions more clearly. We'll get started by transforming this image into a black and white version. First, let's go to Layer, New Fill Layer, and Solid Color, and I'll call this black and white. At this point, we want to type in a code that is 80, 80, 80, which will bring us a perfect 50% middle gray. Hit OK, and then switch that to color blending mode. This gives us a perfect black and white image. Now, the second component of the assist is going to be a curves layer that we can flexibly adjust throughout our retouching process and use to make the imperfections even more apparent. I'll call this contrast, and I'll toss these two assist layers into an assist folder. Let's take a closer look at the assist for a second. A good assist will do 50% of the job for you. Meanwhile, a bad assist will pretty much mean that you can't do the job at all. So let's take a look at how to actually dial in a good assist. I'm going to go into this contrast curve here and reset it for now. Our objective is to create the highest amount of contrast possible between the different areas of brightness in the face. So the best tool to use for this is going to be the hand tool, which permits us to take specific luminosity points directly from the image and pull them up or down. So in this case, I'm going to take a shadow point and pull it down a little bit. And I want to make sure that I can still see detail in the shadows here. Next, I'll take a midtone and sort of decide whether I want to pull that up or down, depending on, if I'm trying to build contrast there or not. So for example, in this case, I'm going to try to build more contrast between the midtones and the highlights. So I'll pull the midtone down, and lastly take a highlight and pull it up. Now, as you can see, this is a really good balance where we're seeing a lot of the problem areas. Meanwhile, if I took this highlight and pulled it up even higher, we would start losing detail. Losing detail means that everything just kind of turns into this flat surface here, both in the shadows and in the highlights. And here we can't really see much at all anymore. So that's what we're trying to prevent. So once again, I'll take a highlight point and just pull it up enough to retain detail and also expand contrast. So this is a really great assist that'll work for the whole face. And then we can always dial in specific assists that will, favor just the highlights or the shadows later if we need. Seeing these issues is really a matter of practice, and it doesn't really come naturally to us. So when you're first starting out, if you'd like a little bit more clarity in where these issues are, you might want to use a secondary assist that will make them even more visible. I've attached a LUT to the download that you're welcome to use, and to pull it up, you can go into the color lookup adjustment and then click here on Load 3D LUT and pull up the correct LUT. If you'd prefer to have it permanently in this drop-down menu, you can drop the file into the following folder. Alternatively, these instructions are also in a text file. In this case, I've imported this LUT and I have it up here as additional dodge and burn assist, so I'll pull that up. And it can either layer on top of our already existing assist, or it can also stand on its own. on its own, it's not flexible in terms of its brightness, so if we want to adjust the contrast, we can do that underneath in our previous assist. So what this lookup table does is that it separates the highlights, midtones, and shadows not just by brightness, but also by hue. So now it is even more evident where we have transition problems, where we have disruptions, and where things are sort of out of place. So let's go ahead and identify the problem areas. I'll pull up a blank layer just to mark them, and I'll use a red paintbrush for the disruptions first. So disruptions are going to be any sort of isolated areas that are too dark or too light for their surroundings. So we can see this even in the black and white version. The color lookup makes it a little bit more visible. So for example, we have this under eye circle that is, considerably darker than its surroundings. We also have this sort of patch down here that is a little bit darker than its surroundings. And we have a couple of other smaller isolated areas that just don't quite blend in with everything around them. This area, for example, is a little bit too light. This area is a little bit too dark. So these are all disruptions. Now, some of them we might have a hard time seeing them as they're sort of disappearing into the shadows. So at this point, we can also adjust our assist and, brighten it, darken it, make it more flexible for the sake of seeing the shadows a little bit better. So I'd say there's not much else here in terms of disruptions, maybe a couple around here, some like that. However, most issues that we're going to find here in the shadows are going to be transition problems. Identifying transitions and transition issues can sometimes take a little more practice than seeing disruptions. The first step is to become aware of where transitions even run in the face. So let's remind ourselves that the face is a three-dimensional shape, and different areas of depth will be visible as different levels of brightness. So for a second here, let's jump ahead to the fully retouched image and break it down into some brightness levels. This is what that looks like. Essentially, I've applied the posterize adjustment layer with 10 levels. The result is kind of this topographical map of the face. Super cool. As we go into this analysis, I would recommend thinking of the face in terms of sectors, each falling off from light to dark, which represent each of their individual shapes. Okay, so let's take a closer look at our map, starting with the brightest zones. These are the highest points of the face, favoring whichever direction the light is coming from, of course. So, in this case, the light is coming from the right-hand side, so it sort of hits the cheek and the nose sectors first. Then the light starts falling onto other sectors as well, the forehead, the chin, and the other cheek. As we move through the zones, you can see the light gradually fall off into darkness. We are moving from the center of each sector closer to the outer edges. Finally, we hit the darkest levels. You will find these all the way around the perimeters of the face, as well as around individual sectors. Okay, so what is all this for? Why do we need to think about this, or even know any of this? To figure that out, let's keep this map up, but switch to the unretouched version of the image. Okay, so suddenly those shapes are very messy and the edges are jagged instead of smooth. One more time, here is the retouched version, and I'm going to roughly mark the levels. And now here is the unretouched version, where we can see all those little outliers that don't quite belong. So, our objective of local dodge and burn is of course to create smooth transitions between these levels. Now, all this may seem overly complicated at first, but I promise not only will it get intuitive super quickly, but this approach will also by far maintain the most structural integrity of the face and look the most natural. All you really need to do while learning this is just to keep this idea of the levels in the back of your mind while you're retouching. I'll be pointing out where these transitions run during our retouch and make them as visible as possible to you when it is relevant. Okay, so back to our regular view. Let's use this new knowledge to identify our transition issues. I'm going to mark these with blue. So, for example, up here we have a pretty harsh line on the temple. Here this line is a little bit more uneven, and then kind of runs unevenly across the forehead there. Here down the nose, we have a very harsh transition, so we might want to soften that. This transition is also a little bit messy and could be, cleaned up a little bit. Same with this whole area over here, where this cheekbone transitions and then all the way to the lip. Lastly, we can probably refine this transition over on the other side of the cheekbone as well. Okay, I think that makes our issues pretty clear, so I think we're ready to get started. I'm going to work without the color lookup for now, but if you'd prefer to work with it, that's totally fine. I'm going to reset my contrast assist to around where it was before, and then I want to dial in my brush settings. Personally, I don't like to work with a pressure-sensitive brush, even though I am working with a tablet. However, if you would like to work with a pressure-sensitive brush, I do have one attached to the download. In my case, I'm just working with a super simple 0% hardness round brush, and it's going to be at 100% opacity and 1% flow. Always make sure to have the smoothing turned off. To check if your brush is pressure sensitive, you can click on the brush settings and make sure that all these boxes are unchecked if you're just trying to work with a simple brush. Alright, so I'm ready to start working, and just to remind you, I don't want to zoom in past where the face fills the frame. And this is because it'll save us a lot of time, and it'll also retain all that small scale detail that I personally like. And lastly, something that'll happen once in a while when we are working on very small scale detail like this, and we're zoomed in so far, is that we will neglect the medium and large scale areas, and we'll zoom out and still have all those large scale problems that are ultimately causing that uneven feeling. So even if we do want to remove the small scale detail, we should remove the large scale problems first and then do the small scale last. Disruptions are the easiest type of issue to eliminate. For example, let's tackle this one right here. I'm going to go in with a brush size that's approximately the size of the issue that I'm removing, and I'm just going to carefully feather that on. And this is the adjustment so far, and as you can see, I've sort of eliminated that disruption and made this patch blend in much better with its surroundings. Just to remind you, dodging is lightening, so I've lightened that area to make it match. And this is why we want to work with a low flow, because it'll help us do this very gradually until it fits its surroundings well. So that's our first disruption. Let's take a look at another. For example, this under eye circle. Now a quick note about under eye circles. Usually people have two of them. One is going to be the lower one and one is going to be the one directly sort of surrounding the eye. This upper one I generally try to keep, as it's a huge contributor for the eyes having their shape. Meanwhile, the lower one just makes people look tired. So this one I'll go ahead and dodge to brighten it and match it to the surrounding area. So the way I like to work is with my right hand on the tablet pen, of course, and then my left hand is on the bracket keys, continuously sizing the brush up and down to make sure that I can match my brush size exactly to what I'm trying to eliminate. Here's the before, and here's the after. As you can see, that blends in super nicely now. Let's take a look at a couple more disruptions. Up on the forehead, we have a few. One of them, for example, over here, is actually an area that is too light to match the surroundings. Now, if we're having a hard time seeing this, we can expand our contrast curve to make this more visible. So I'll use the hand tool, and I'll specifically look for what this area is. It is a midtone. I can raise that, and then I can lower the surrounding area. So, for example, like this. And everything else doesn't really matter right now. We're just trying to target this, but as you can see, this really helps it stand out. And if something's not standing out enough, you might actually want to move backwards, and that will make it even more visible. So in this case, I'm going to use the burn, and I'm going to carefully fill in this patch. As you can see, that is matching it to the surroundings, and we can kind of feather that on very slowly. So here's the before, and here's the after. I would continuously toggle on and off your assist as well, just so that you can see what your adjustments look like on the real image. So here's the before so far, and here's the after. As you can see, we have eliminated these little patches over here, and also this little patch up here with the dodge and the burn respectively. Okay, so let's continue moving through the face. If we need to eliminate any node points, we can just drag them off of the curve. And this is pretty much the curve that we were working with before, so we can continue to work with that. So I'm going to continue to look for patches that are too dark to fit their surroundings and try to dodge them. And I even like to think of this as sort of erasing them, so that might be a good way to think of it for you as well. Here's a more small scale patch. Here's an even smaller patch. And once again, be patient in terms of seeing these patches more easily and visibly. This is something that just sort of comes with time and practice. Down here, I'm seeing one more patch to dodge, and I think that's about it in terms of dodging disruptions. Now I'm going to see if there are any more disruptions to burn. I'm seeing a little light area right around here. Once again, if you're not quite seeing it, you can increase your assist contrast, so this makes it a lot more visible. We do have this little white spot sort of going on here. So I'm going to fill that with the burn, and then fill this spot with the burn, and then we have one more right around the nose here. As you can see, this entire surrounding is darker, but this patch is lighter, so I'm going to fill that in just a little bit with a burn. Okay, here's the before and after so far, and as you can see, that's already smoothed out quite a bit. Now let's take a look at a couple of transitions. These are issues that are much more difficult to fix than disruptions because they need to be tackled both with the burn and the dodge. First off, we have situations of harsh transitions. For example, we have a pretty harsh transition right here running across her forehead. And that doesn't really belong there because there's no, feature here that the shadow should be defining. So what we're going to do is soften this transition with both the dodge and the burn. What we'll do is lighten the dark side and darken the light side. So in this case, I'm going to lighten the dark side with the dodge. So fill in this darker side of that transition and specifically focus on the darkest spots. And then I'm going to fill in the lighter side with the burn just a little bit. We want to maintain some of this highlight here, so I'm not going to eliminate it entirely. Here's the before and after for that transition. Before, after, before, after. So that is much more smooth now. Let's take a look at the harsh shadow on the nose. This is another example of a harsh transition that we can soften. Now I'm going to eliminate that node point, bring the shadow node point up and the highlight node point as well. And that should give us more visibility here in this shadow. So in this case, once again, I'm going to darken the light side and lighten the dark side. I'll start with the burn here and burn the lighter side and specifically focus on little gaps that might be considerably too light. Now I'm going to dodge the darker side and specifically focus on areas that might be considerably too dark. Here's the before and the after. And we can take a look at that in color as well. Here's the before and the after. As you can see, this transition is much smoother and a little bit more flattering this way. We can now take a look at the second type of transition, which is a transition that is not necessarily too harsh, but just in general sort of messy and convoluted. Here on this side of the nose, you can kind of see we have a clearly defined shape. Over here, there's just a lot sort of running back and forth, and it's just very, very messy. To see these difficult transition areas more clearly, you can definitely go ahead and fine-tune your assist. You might even want to start over and build one directly for this area. So for example, with the hand tool, take a darker point and pull that down, and then take one of the lighter points and pull that up. And then you can fine tune these points up on the curve and make sure that you're building maximum visibility here. So for example, something like that. Alternatively, of course, you can also come in and help out difficult areas like this with a LUT. So for example, I'll turn that on for this adjustment. So let's work in smoothing out this transition. In our minds, we kind of want to draw the line of where this transition should naturally fall, in parallel to the shape of her nose. Instead, it's kind of coming around and making this almost oval shape, so that's what we want to fix. I'm going to work on it with both the dodge and the burn. This time, first with the burn and then the dodge. I'm going to fill this light spot a little bit with the burn first. And then I'm going to eliminate some of the darker spots with the dodge. While we're taking a look at this shadow, we can also follow it down all the way down here, where it is also a little bit harsh. So we can also soften it down here by burning the lighter side and dodging the darker side. So here's our before and after for evening out this transition. And now this might still look like it's not perfect, like you might want to go in and do detail work, but do consider that you have to turn off your assist to really see what's going on here. So here's the before and here's the after. So if we want to do more work here, we definitely can, whether you want to do it with the color lookup or just the black and white. Here we are getting into pretty small scale detail work, so choose for yourself how far you would like to go into detail here. In this case, I'm using the burn to fill some of the little gaps. These are essentially a collection of very small scale disruptions right next to each other. And then I'm going to use the dodge to remove any of the darker patches. So here's the before and here's the after. And once again, I want to make sure that this looks good in color. So here's the before and here's the after. It looks much smoother now, but we have actually retained all of this detail and texture so that it still looks like skin. Next, let's take a look at the transitions in the forehead. First, we'll focus on the transitions in the highlights and midtones. So in this case, I'll just pull the curve down and add a highlight point to specifically bring out these gradients. So here we can see a couple of small-scale disruptions that are sort of causing this transition to kind of go all over the place. So I'll fill those in with the burn. If you're wondering how long my brush strokes are, I generally press and hold for quite a while, as I find this to be the most efficient approach, especially at 1% flow. Some people like to come in with single brush strokes, so for example, 1, 2, 3. I find this to be very time consuming, so my brush strokes look more like 1, pressing and holding, pressing and holding, pressing and holding, and that's it. 2, pressing and holding, and so on. So once again, I find this to be the most efficient approach. Okay, let's take a look at the status of this current transition. This is before, and this is after. So we already have a much sort of smoother shape running through the forehead right now. Same if we take a look at this in color. This is the before and this is the after. So now perhaps we can take a look at the transition from the shadows to the midtones. So let's boost this curve back up so we have more details in the shadows and midtones. And here we can kind of see that we have the darkest patch here and then it sort of feathers very unevenly. We have it kind of coming out through here and it's just a bit of a messy transition over here. So let's target that. If we want, we can expand the contrast even more for more visibility, maybe something like this. And if we're still having a hard time seeing it, of course, we can bring back the LUT. So now we can see pretty clearly that these edges are just sort of all over the place and not creating smooth shapes. So let's try to even that out. I'm going to start with the burn and fill some of the lighter patches in this transition here. So anything that's, in this case, magenta, I'll fill that in very, very lightly with the burn. Next, I'm going to focus my attention on some of the darker patches on the darker side and fill those in with the dodge. Here's the before and after for that. Before, after. So now it is a much more smooth and uniform shape running across your forehead here. We can do the same thing correcting for this other transition coming through here. As you can see, we can go as little or as far into detail here as we'd like to smooth out all of these transitions. The large-scale changes are really the most important, but if we want to make more small-scale changes like this, we absolutely can. Let's take a quick look at our darkest shadows, and then I think we are good on the forehead. I'm going to brighten my contrast curve up all the way to see into these deepest shadows. And as you can see here, we have a transition problem where we are sort of going from light to dark and then have this light disruption and then dark at the very end. So I'm actually just going to fix this light disruption with my burn, fill that in, and make it match the surroundings. And I believe that's all we have to do here. Taking a look at this in color, we'll notice that this transition is still a little bit harsh. So if we'd like, we can also soften this with our technique of burning the lighter side and dodging the darker side. Here's the before and the after for that section, and now it looks pretty smooth in color, so I'm happy with that. Let's move on to the cheekbones, which are usually pretty complex areas in terms of figuring out the transitions and how to smooth them out. In the meantime, let's discuss a little bit of troubleshooting and some frequent difficulties. Something that a lot of people encounter is trying to figure out whether to dodge or to burn something. If it is a disruption, it's usually pretty obvious whether it should be dodged or burned. Meanwhile, if it is a transition, usually that just implies that it should be both dodged and burned. Hopefully that makes it a little bit easier. Next up, something that often happens to people is over flattening the face, and this will happen if we dodge a lot but don't burn enough. So you can check yourself to see how much dodging and burning you've done by pressing and holding Option or Alt and clicking on your dodge and burn masks. Here, as you can see, I've done almost an equal amount in dodge and burn, but a little bit more in dodge. So in this case, what I'm going to do moving forward is to focus more attention on the burn. I'm going to sort of choose the burn as my home base and mostly start tackling transitions from the burn first. So for example, this transition here, as you can see, it is a little bit harsh. I'm going to burn the lighter side to sort of feather that edge. Same thing up here, we have a pretty harsh line coming through. I'll burn that side and then I'll dodge second. Because usually the first tool that we start with, dodge or burn, will do most of the work, and then the second one will sort of supplement it. Here's the before and the after of this area so far. I feel like we've worked with the LUT enough, so I'm going to eliminate it for the rest of the process and just continue to work with the black and white to get you guys kind of used to seeing that. Here I'm going to adjust my contrast curve to work as well as possible for this transition area and see these sort of in-between steps in this gradient. We can kind of check by raising and lowering the midtone where it's going to make our issues most apparent. This looks pretty good to me. So now if we're looking at this transition, we kind of notice it just, once again, it kind of goes all over the place. There's no smooth edge to it. So once again, I'm going to start with the burn and try to look for any sort of disruptions on both the darker and the lighter side of just smaller patches that are too bright. And then I'll fill those in. Basically, what I'm trying to do here is create a bit of a more uniform edge. So if we need an aid here, we can always pull up an assist layer and just pencil in the actual shape that we're trying to build more cleanly. And then sometimes that can actually really help us try to fill those gaps in more efficiently. So here, I'm just looking for any gaps on that darker side to fill in with the burn. And then I'll look for any disruptions on the lighter side to erase with the dodge. Okay, let's remove that line, and if we toggle on and off the dodge and burn, you can see that we have created a much more distinctive shape. Now all we have going on is that the shape might be a little too harsh, at which point of course we can soften it again by gently dodging the darker side and burning the lighter side. Here's the before and after for this cheek. Here's the before, and here's the after. As you can see, this transition is now super smooth, but we have maintained all that nice natural texture and detail in her cheek. Okay, let's tackle the last section of her face, a little bit of the chin and the other cheek. Now, if you're running into issues where you feel like your dodge and burn is applying too patchy, that could be a number of problems. First off, it could be that you've accidentally set your flow too high. Personally, I'll work with a 2% flow once in a while, but nothing really higher than that, and I prefer to work at 1%. Another potential problem might be with your hardware. If you're having issues with patchy transitions and patchy application, you might want to check your tablet and pen settings and do some hardware troubleshooting. Here, once again, I'm starting with the burn and filling any lighter gaps on the darker shadow side of this transition. Then I'm going to dodge any darker disruptions on the lighter side. With this, I have to kind of make sure that I'm not accidentally removing any of her freckles. So once in a while, I want to toggle off the assist and again, make sure that I'm not removing anything that's part of her face. Once in a while, you will find issues to sort of show up in weird lines. So for example, here, this is a bit of a line. This here is coming through as a line. Sometimes issues just arrange themselves in sort of this line form, and looking out for that can make them easier to identify. Down here, we're also seeing a couple of those lines. Some are much smaller than others. Once again, the level of detail that you go into is entirely up to you and your personal taste. Okay, I'm going to take this assist back off, and I'm going to soften this transition now as it's a little bit harsh, seeing as we've sort of built it around that assist. So once again, I will softly burn the lighter side, and then I will dodge the darker side. If we need any more attention on little patches, now's a good time for that. Lastly, let's take a look at our chin. So in this case, some of it is dipping into the shadows, so I'll bring my points on the curve back up, make sure that I'm still retaining full visibility in the highlights, and take a look at those transitions. Now, for example, here we have a very strange transition going on that is sort of currently folding all across here. So let's see if we can kind of smooth that out into a softer shape, kind of like that, and then this secondary shadow will kind of come in around here. Once again, I'll burn any bright patches, and then I'll dodge any dark patches. What's really important when it comes to these transitions is to always pay close attention to the natural shape of her chin. So in this case, she has this little sort of indent at the bottom of the chin, which is why we're not just coming across with a straight shadow and instead have this little detour. We always want to make sure to maintain as much of the original bone structure and the integrity of the face as possible. We don't really want to, move around her bones or make her look like someone else. For the chin, here's the before and here's the after. And this is what it looks like in color, before and after. Alright, so I'm really happy with the face, all of its disruptions and transitions. Here's an overall before and after. Now I want to spend a little bit of time on some of the details, for example, the lips and the eyes. This is something that I will zoom into, and this is of course also totally optional and up to you. For the lips, I generally work with a flow of around 4 or 5%, as they're usually pretty high in contrast, so they need a little bit more flow to really attack them properly. Here I'm just removing any disruptions that I'm noticing. If they're hard to see, I can zoom out a little bit. We can actually see a bit of a line disruption that's going all the way across her upper lip, so I'm going to carefully dodge that. Generally, we want the brightest part of the lip to be the center of the lip, and then we want there to be fall off to the sides and to the bottom of it, and that's what's going to make them look really sort of full. So I'm sort of correcting for that a little bit here with a dodge. Here's the before and the after so far, and then I can come in with the burn and soften the transition of the shadow that's coming in from the sides. Here's the before and the after for the lips, and as you can see, that's really helped us sort of soften out the shape of them and also eliminate some of those darker spots. Let's see if the eyes need any attention. I remember that we were having some trouble with the healing brush over here, and it left behind some sort of residue, so if we want, we can dodge that. Here's the before and the after, and same thing on the other side if we need. Lastly, we can dedicate a little bit of attention to the neck and any other exposed areas of skin. Alternatively, we could also frequency separate these, but since it's not a lot of skin here, I'm just going to go ahead and do some very rough dodge and burn on it. Once again, I would definitely say, since there's not a lot of attention on this, we don't need to dedicate a lot of attention to it. However, having a perfectly retouched face and then an unretouched neck is very noticeable actually, so we do want to find a healthy balance somewhere in between. And here's the before and the after. Very subtle retouch down there. Okay, so that's it for me in terms of the local dodge and burn. Here's the before and here's the after in black and white, and in color, here's the before and the after. And as you can see, we have really maintained the integrity of both her skin texture and her face shape and all of her features. So personally, I feel like we've already gone pretty detailed on this retouch. Generally, I go a little bit less detailed than this. However, if you would like to go more detailed, you absolutely can. If you're the type of person who likes to sit down with a cup of tea and some music and just zoom in all the way and just chill and dodge and burn for an hour or something, that's totally fine. I know a lot of people really enjoy that as well. So, you definitely want to prioritize and take care of the large to mid-scale problems first, and then the small-scale problems. Here's an example of what that extra step would look like. Here's the before, and here's the after. So this is about 30 minutes of extra dodging and burning for small-scale detail. So you can take a look at that here on the mask. As you can see, it is much more small-scale detail than the previous dodge and burn that we did. So here's the dodge and the burn for those little fixes, and here's the before, and here's the after. Here it is one more time from further out, before and after. So as you can see, it does smooth it out a bit, but personally I prefer not to go this far into detail as I like retaining as much of the natural skin texture as possible. And also, as you can see, this difference is much more insignificant than the original pass that we did here, even though this detail work took me about twice as long as our original pass. So generally, I don't find it efficient in terms of my use of time. Once again, this is totally subjective and entirely up to your style. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and eliminate this for the sake of our tutorial and move forward without the detail retouch. Now, before we conclude this chapter, I want to mention 2 difficult lighting scenarios that will make local dodge and burn considerably more difficult. The first one would be working with a hard light shot. Hard light brings its own challenges with it in terms of having very, very hard edges and fast transitions from light to shadow. In this case, our primary challenge is going to be figuring out how to smooth those edges out. Another challenge will be with high contrast in the face. We might need to bump up the intensity of our dodge and burn curves to be able to actually make significant enough shifts to balance between these light and shadow areas. Sometimes these heavy shifts will then result in discoloration, which can be fixed in color correction. It's just something to be prepared for. A second very challenging scenario is working with unflattering lighting. Sometimes we have shots with very unflattering natural or available light that we're sort of forced to work with, and those will be very difficult to retouch and especially contour in a flattering way. So to be completely honest, I'd try to just choose another shot instead. The easiest lighting to retouch is frontal soft light with the source at eye level or higher. So here on Keep, for example, we do have sort of sidey frontal soft light, and it does bring out her imperfections to some degree, and it does give us some shape in the face. It's not perfectly flat frontal lighting. However, it is definitely still flattering. Trying to compensate for bad lighting with dodge and burn is possible, but it gets into digital relighting territory and is not only very challenging, but also rarely looks realistic or good. So it's really just not something I would recommend. I would say the more you can study and learn good lighting, the more time you'll save yourself in your retouch. Okay, so that's it for the local dodge and burn section. As a quick reminder, please do be patient with this technique, as it does take a little bit of time to internalize, especially in terms of spotting the inconsistencies. Our objectives for this chapter were evening out disruptions and transitions in luminosity, and the tools we used were curves and a contrast assist. Let's move on to contouring.